Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier. In my presentation looking at fundamental factors that help explain why the American economy boomed in the 1920s, I did say that there was another way of looking at that economy. Well, this presentation will do just that, and in doing so, we'll begin the explanation as to why the economy crashed at the end of the decade. For the roots of that crash actually lie in the way the economy was run in the boom years. Now I'm going to begin this presentation by looking at what happened during World War I, which had done so much to set the American economy up for the boom years. Because whilst it did, it also set the seeds, and you must forgive the pun, for American farmers to struggle, even while the economy seemed to be reaching dizzying heights. During the war, wheat farmers had been encouraged to grow more. They benefited from improved fertilizer and the introduction of farm machinery, which led to an increase in efficiency. But after the war, with a reduction in demand, they were overproducing for the home market. At the same time, European farmers had recovered from the war, and Europe no longer needed American wheat in the same quantities they once had. What foodstuffs Europe did import, it did so from Canada, whose wheat farmers had also improved their efficiency, as well as the likes of Australia and Argentina. Consequently, with too much wheat being produced, prices fell steadily throughout the 1920s. American farmers with mortgage payments on their farms, or else with loans for their machinery, found they couldn't pay the banks who foreclosed on their farms. I also talked about America's abundance of resources when explaining the boom years, and I began by explaining the importance of people. There were a lot of American people in the 1920s, 106 million of them, but not enough of them were included in the consumer-driven boom. If you've listened to that presentation, you'll also remember I said that most Americans actually lived on or below the poverty line. Well, they weren't buying anything that wasn't essential. Far from it. Consequently, manufacturing was soon overproducing. By 1929, the consumer boom had reached saturation point. Industry was paying the price for maximizing profit at the expense of wages. If people had been paid more, the consumer boom would have spread down to the working class more and would have lasted longer. As it was, the consumer boom had reached its limit. Those that could afford to buy consumer goods had done so. And now car plants and factories making electrical appliances, who like farming have become much more efficient at producing goods, found that they were now producing more goods than they could sell. It started a vicious cycle or spiral. As factory owners laid off workers and unemployment rose, and wages were lowered for many of those still in work, so fewer people could afford manufactured goods, and so more and more were laid off as demand dropped even further. As we have just noted, perhaps if wages had risen in line with profits, the market for consumer goods wouldn't have slowed. Greed would therefore be a factor in this. But as it was, the market for consumer goods had indeed been saturated. And so I'll come to the third fundamental factor that did so much to explain the boom years, Republican policies. Now there were two critically important problems lying within those policies. A lack of regulation that encouraged risk and debt, and tariffs. As I've said, American farmers had been encouraged to grow as much as they could, and many had extended their farms, buying more land with loans, or else had taken out loans to buy machinery, often mortgaging their farms to do so. They now found that they couldn't pay the banks, and as I've said, those banks foreclosed on their farms. Some of the banks weren't as careful as they should have been. 500 banks had failed in the boom decade. They were mostly small banks who had lent too much money and didn't have sufficient funds. But still, these are all signs that the economy was not as healthy as it appeared to be. And on a personal basis, debt had mounted, with consumer goods bought on hire purchase and houses bought with mortgages, which with jobs lost, or else shorter hours being worked or lower wages being paid, could no longer be afforded. Also, America's policy of protecting its home market by imposing tariffs was coming back to bite them, as Europe imposed its own tariffs on American goods. The tariff war, instigated by America, closed markets to American manufactured goods, as it had to American farm produce. And none of this was reflected in share prices, which kept rising and rising as if there was not a problem to be seen in the wider economy. But that's the subject for another presentation. For this presentation, it only remains for me to thank you for listening. But before I go, let me tell you about my podcast. It's called Making Sense of This Crazy World. And as I say each week in introducing an episode, my aim is to use history to help explain the crazy world we live in today. It's been running for a year now, so there are plenty of mini-series that might pique your interest. Check it out, if you're not approaching the dreaded exam season, that is. If you're interested in history, you should find it interesting. But that's it from me for now. Cheers.